I am welcome back to day 4 of the nation's first virtual festival. I think it's been an extraordinary 4 days, and you have a treat coming now. I'm delighted to introduce two inimitable people. First, Dorian Warren, president of Community Change, co-chair of the Economic Security Project, a progressive scholar, organizer, media personality. Dorian has worked to advance racial, economic, and social justice over the last decades. He has also worked at MSNBC as a contributor and host, as well as the executive producer of Nerding Out on MSNBC's digital platform. He serves on the board, many boards. My favorite board is the Nation editorial board, but he serves on many boards. And as a commentator on politics and public affairs, Dorian appears regularly on television, radio outlets, and thrilled that was his longtime colleague, friend, extraordinary person, Melissa Harris Perry. They're taking up the nation's new and exciting podcast, System Check. And Melissa is a force. Someone just put in the chat, they remember listening to her radio show. It might have been her show at MSNBC, where she really pioneered a form which we need back. And I hope System Check will play that role. But she had kind of seminars of wit and rousing spirit every weekend morning from 10 to 12. Melissa is the Maya Angelou Presidential Chair and Professor in the Department of Politics and International Affairs in the Department of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at Wake Forest. She's a founder and president of the Anna Julia Cooper Center, longtime columnist, contributor to The Nation, and she is the co-host of the nation's first new but very different podcast called System Check. And we're thrilled about it. It is, I think, very much of the moment when I think so many people see revealed the MRI of a system that is, we've long known it's in need of not only a kick, but real structural reform. And I can't think of two people who will bring humor, expertise, understanding to such a podcast. They've done 4 shows, got to listen to them, and we're thrilled to be partnering. Thank you for being here today at the festival. Over
Thanks,
to
Katrina.
you.
Happy to join you. But don't go anywhere yet. Don't go anywhere yet.
Yes. Leave Katrina in the room.
Leave Katrina in the room, because Katrina.
I was so happy to be part of your election night. How election night? It's like a rolling 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 days. That night was, a moment. And I was on with Stephen Phillips, who writes regularly for The Nation as well. Very interesting about the rising American majority. And Julian Zelizer. Don't know people on the call, but he's a really interesting historian of American politics. And I think I see Newt Gingrich on my email all the time these days. He's back. And I think Julian has marked and covered the Congress in interesting ways, and how it needs to be revived and system checked. And Cheryl and Eiffel was great.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, she's all the folks who you've just named are they're kind of precisely what we're up to here, and it's it's a combination of things. One, it's about having an opportunity to go back and grab some of the friends and colleagues who Dorian and I work with and continue to work with. So Julian Zelizer and I have known each other since our daughters were in kindergarten, and both of our kids are now college freshmen. So some of it is about like regathering the family in a very sort of nation way, right? So finding all those people who fed you intellectually and then continuing to grow that. But then another big part of it is trying to expand that family so that we are engaging all of the folks who are doing work, a lot of them very young people. And I guess maybe we were always this young, but I am now older. And so everyone seems very young to me who's doing all of this extraordinary work in communities.
Yeah, no, it's been a movement moment for a while, but the ecosystem now is so full of independent grassroots groups, people, and they're young. I mean, really young. And they're seeing anew what I think we saw, but they're bringing new ideas and new ways of organizing and new, they're more daring in some ways. I think they're more willing to And it's across the board, I mean, your racial justice, environmental justice, gender justice, economic justice, overlaid by this moment, right? The crisis, the COVID crisis. So you got a lot to work with. What's next? What's next on the, what's upcoming?
Well, as you mentioned, Katrina, we've done 4 shows. The very first show was looking at our system of casting ballots and looking at the challenges to casting a vote, right? And in this country, we know for most of the history of the United States, most eligible adults have been not allowed to vote, particularly Black folks, but not limited to Black folks. And in some ways, when you think of the youth of this democracy, people point back to 1776 or 1789. I agree with many scholars and political scientists who would argue that we didn't really become a true democracy until 1965. So we're actually even younger than we think, because the Jim Crow South was actually a one-party racial authoritarian set of states, right? That excluded Black people altogether from citizenship. So we're a young democracy. We take up the question, though, of casting a vote in the first episode. The second episode looks at what is our system of counting the votes? And what are the structural barriers, like the Electoral College, for instance, or winner-take-all districts, right? What are the barriers, voter suppression, long lines that we saw? What are the barriers to counting the vote? And what are some of the systemic reforms and transformations that we might think about and imagine together? Then the third episode, we go to Georgia.
Oh, yeah.
We go to Georgia to really try to unpack and tell the story of why Georgia was a surprise to so many people in terms of going blue. And Melissa knows this. I like to think of Georgia, and you might include Arizona in this, as political earthquakes. That if you think of the metaphor or the analogy of an earthquake, right, there is slow-moving plate tectonics over a long period of time that are often invisible. That's organizing. Yep. That's grassroots organizing. So over a decade, particularly in Georgia, there was organizing happening. And it turns out, even though we did not interview Stacey Abrams, she shows up all over the episode because she has been organizing on the ground and developing a new generation of leaders. Right.
And a new generation, this infrastructure, right, of people.
Exactly, of infrastructure.
And many women organizing groups, but on the ground. And in Arizona, the same way. I never loved the idea that it was McCain's widow and his daughter who brought Arizona. It was Latino organizers who've been working for more than a decade. And so you're so right, they're tectonic plates that have been moving. And Stacey Abrams brought energy to it because I don't think she dominated, but she kind of elevated. And I think there is an understanding now that people shouldn't parachute into Georgia, but respect and give dignity to the groups which have worked so hard on the ground. But Georgia on our mind.
Georgia on our mind. And so that's episode 3. And then episode 4 this week, hot off the press, we asked the question, why are people poor? And look at the system of poverty in America. And next week, preview, we will take up part 2 of our series on poverty to ask the questions, what is to be done
great.
about poverty in America?
A question I always love.
Yeah, and I think, Dorian, as you were going through them, I was actually thinking about each of the shows and sort of how we felt in the creation of them. And, in some ways, Georgia was the first show that felt fun. At that, the first 2 was sort of just gripping our hands and wondering where we were going to be as a nation. And by the time we got to Georgia, it was clear not only that, that Vice President Biden, now President-elect Biden, had won the presidential election. But I think for Dorian and I, part of what is simply more fun is that opportunity to
Oh, Melissa, we lost your sound.
So we need your
your voice back. So I will.
Oh no, where'd I go?
There you are. Now you're back.
Oh no.
You're back.
You're back.
I wonder if I'm being hacked by Russian bots.
Oh no, that's my side of the aisle.
No, but so it was just to say that I think part of it will be more enjoyable and maybe more valuable in terms of the voice that Dorian and I can bring, and the voices we can elevate. As I like to say, I didn't feel, people would sometimes say to me, oh, we need you during the Trump administration. I was like, no, you don't. It's terribly obvious what's happening. Like, I don't feel like I can add a lot to this conversation. But we're entering a moment in American politics now where I think both the relief about coming out of the Trump years and ways in which the left sometimes holds accountable in some ways and not in others, but that insider conversation, that insider check is the one I'm always much more engaged and excited to do. And so Georgia was our first, we could take a breath and really relax into the thing that we think we'll be best at in this podcast.
Well, I'm going to leave you two to talk together. I had a great time on your election show. I mean, it was a lot of fun in its own way. And I think you bring humor and fun to very serious issues, which is a great way to engage people. And we're so thrilled we are doing this together, and I will leave you two. Take care.
Thank you so much, Katrina.
Take care. All right.
Okay, Melissa. So, I have a question for you.
Okay.
So the Democrats win the election?
Oh, man, that's a good question, because it's not really completely clear. Certainly, the Biden-Harris ticket won both the popular vote and the Electoral College vote, which is good and bad because it also means there'll be a little less pressure on the Electoral College question. But did we win, or did Democrats win? I'm not sure I always want to use the we on that. In a decennial census year, not winning the state legislatures might just simply be a loss, no matter who takes the White House. And obviously the razor thin margins in the House, and no matter what happens in the Senate, those very narrow margins in the Senate, in a time that is so overwhelmingly partisan in the federal Congress, I don't know if if anyone has won, not only Democrats, but maybe more importantly, the issues and communities that you and I care most about.
So that was a trick question.
Right, I figured.
Because
but I will
it was a little setup.
But I will say this, Dorian, as a college professor, and you work with a young staff, it was good. So in 2016, when I led college students doing voter engagement work and political engagement work, and all of these really excited, young progressives voted for the first time and lost in that brutalizing way, it was really tough for them. And so I will say that watching a new group of these very young people get engaged, and then what feels like a win for them because they won at the presidential level, and especially for young voters, that's like so much that initial focus. I am happy that I voted for John Kerry. It don't take much to make me happy, but it's nice for them to have a win.
But so you just said something really important. You just said you vote for John Kerry, and so that takes me back to 2004 because I asked that question to you on purpose because I'm actually pretty furious this Saturday morning in November. About the state of the Democratic Party. And let me tell you why. So after John Kerry's loss, there was a whole lot of hand-wringing within the Democratic Party and the progressive movement, about why the Democrats couldn't win against a very unpopular president, unpopular war. And so I remember right after that campaign, and particularly Howard Dean's role in the primaries, there was a strategy of a 50-state strategy, right? Of the Democratic, that's 2004. Now here we are in 2020, and let me just mention 2010 as a midway point to where we are, right? So 50-state strategy, we were going to build the party to win elections. So then 2010, President Obama called it a shellacking, almost 1,000 seats lost in state houses around the country. That, as you mentioned, set up redistricting, right, and the gerrymandering of districts for a whole decade. And by gerrymandering, right, the rules of the game, which we often don't focus enough on, that advantage Republicans across the country. So 10 years of supposedly figuring out how to build a party structure and infrastructure. And here we are in 2020. Yes, we defeated Trump. We did not defeat Trumpism, but if we have a sober assessment, when you look down ballot, I'm struck by Joan Walsh's piece in The Nation this week that kind of goes into this a little bit in terms of what happened down ballot. It's a mixed bag. It's a contradictory bag. And it makes me furious that, 16 years after 2004 and a decade after 2010, that there are no consequences for losing in the Democratic Party, that there are no consequences for people with bad strategies who continue to get rich because they are consultants and so they pay for ads and all that kind of stuff. There are no consequences for losing. And I'm really worked up about this because in my home state of Illinois, there was, just to use one example, then I will shut up. But
I love this.
Thank you for the chat this Saturday morning. In my home state of Illinois, there was an incredible opportunity to pass and to increase the income tax that would pay for vital services and public goods for the residents of the state, particularly residents of color, low-income residents, even white rural folks. And it failed. And it failed 53-47, but there was $50 million put into that effort, that ballot initiative, by the richest governor in the country. And none of it was invested in grassroots organizing or infrastructure that could have made the difference. Now, by the way, Black people, particularly in Chicago, showed up and voted overwhelmingly, like 80%, right? But this is it's just illustrative of the continued failed strategy, yes, of the Democratic Party that focuses on commercials and air wars and coming into particularly Black and Latinx communities 3 weeks before the election. And then they leave and we don't hear from them for 2 more years, right, on election cycles. And I'm just really frustrated. What would it take? What would it take? And as we explore in our Georgia episode, there is a formula here. There is a strategy here for deep grassroots investment and actually building the power of ordinary folks that can transform the state. All politics is local, and the route to national power is actually through the states. Yep. And so here we are waiting with bated breath on a Senate, 2 Senate seats in Georgia on January 5th. And everybody is going to throw down, but it shouldn't have even come to that at the end of the day.
So yes, and so yes, and yes to all of that. And at the same time, I keep thinking of 2020 as such a bizarro year. And bizarre in part because it actually taught us a thing that I think, Dorian, you and I really know as political scientists, which is that low voter turnout was never about voter apathy. It was always about the barriers, right? The barriers to actually casting a ballot. And one of the most extraordinary things that happened this year is that COVID-19, for all of its deathly evil, actually ended up lowering the barriers to voting. It was easier to vote in more places this year than, and particularly much easier than it would have been in a post-voting rights era election, right? So imagine there'd been no COVID-19, right? And we go into this second presidential election in a context of without the Voting Rights Act. And what would likely have happened would have been voter suppression felt at a much higher scale. So instead we get this, national turnout, right, across the country of all the different peoples, right? All the people showing up, right? And showing up in part because they didn't have to show up, right? They didn't all have to show up on Tuesday. They didn't all have to vote in person. And as soon as we expanded that capacity to cast a ballot, we expanded our electorate. So part of what happens there is some of our insights, some of our consulting has to change if we're going to continue to exist in a world that allows, in fact, more Americans to vote. Then I think we're going to have to make some different presumptions about what happens when you have higher turnout. So that's one. The second thing I would say is, one of the things that Democrats get wrong is white guys. And they get them wrong in part by at white women too, but particularly white men in this election, because it's certainly one way to explain an awful lot of the seemingly quirky results is that Black people and brown people mostly voted the way they always do, which is to say they show up at rates higher than you would expect, and their vote choice is overwhelmingly for the Democratic Party. And white women voted about the way you always expect them to vote, which is they split their vote about half and half with a slight majority for the Republicans. Now, that has been true for both Black and brown people basically since 1945. But white boys this year showed up, and a much higher percentage of white boys voted for Biden. But I presume they still all voted for the Republicans everywhere but Biden, right? Mm-hmm. So to me, part of what I see here is the continuing impact of white men. Now, that doesn't mean we should go try to win them. It means that they have an outsized impact, right, on deciding these elections in some really important ways. This is not me like jumping on the, yes, let's think about white boys train. It's to say, I think we should think about them slightly differently. I don't think they showed up and voted for Democrats. I think they showed up and were like, Trump, that's not, okay. Now, a majority of them still voted for Trump, but like just enough, right? And it's always at the margins in a national election. Just enough of white boys at the margins were like, yeah, no Trump. But I would like every other thing that Trumpism brings, right? I actually want Trumpism. I just don't want Trump. And so they vote for all of the other pieces. And so, yes, the Democratic Party is a mess, but also I think even our understanding of what happened in 2020 is not yet completely revealed. We still need time, right? It's my academic self. Right. My journalist self says, election's over, wrap it, let's go to the next topic. But my academic self says, let's keep playing with these numbers. Let's keep trying to figure out what happened here. But in the meantime, the organizing part, right, the activist part of me says, I don't really care how we got here. I mean, I sort of care, but mostly I care about the consequences of what happens now that we're here. And so now that we're here, how do we make those investments that you've just talked about, Dorian? How do we elevate the folks who we know when we turn them out will vote in particular ways? And crucially, how do we begin to think about a system check on gerrymandering? Because we are about to face an even more entrenched version of that. And then the very last thing is, I appreciate that you drew our attention here thinking about who gets paid for elections. And the idea of consultants who are paid a lot and pollsters who are paid a lot and activists who are paid very little. Because one of the things that happened in our Georgia episode that I think we didn't have a chance just in the context of it to fully highlight is how much the folks in Georgia were saying to us that the difference maker was when sort of the Abrams machine, if you will, was able to direct resources to the state in such a way that created activism and organizing as a living wage gig. And that if it's not, you just like, when you have pollsters making millions, right? Like, and having these win bonuses, right? But organizers don't get a win bonus, right? They don't get an extra, 200,000 either for their own pockets or for their organizations, if in fact they win. And that would be that would be game changing if they did.
You mentioned a couple of things I want to go back to for a minute, because there is an interesting empirical question when you focus on white men and white women. And here's one thing we know, and this is in the line of why movements and organizations matter. When a white man or a white woman are a member of a union, they actually vote a different way, right? So that actually, and guess who knows that? Guess who knows that? Let me reach into my memory. Oh yes, Scott Walker in Wisconsin knows that. Because when he became governor in 2011, what was the first thing he did? Attract the structural foundation of the Democratic Party, which was public sector unions and the workers that are members of those unions. Like that was an explicit attack on the fundamental power, a source of power on the left and among progressives. And we almost never think that way. Right? We're just like, okay, we won the national election. Okay, now what? Okay, let's focus on Biden. Yes, we should get there in a minute. But there's never a look and say, okay, so what are the the legs of the stool of conservative power, right? Whether that's the Supreme Court or the Electoral College, for instance, or whether it's evangelicals or the NRA. That is not part of the thinking about how do we, in some ways, frankly, I'll just say it, disempower the right.
So, okay, all right. So wait, I want to come to you on that. Do we want to disempower the right, or do we want to fight for the soul of the Republican Party? And let me be clear.
You're a two-party person. I know you're gonna go there. You love two-party competition.
I do love a two-party conversation. It's because I'm a teacher, right? And it's both. My dog. It is both because I'm a teacher, but it's also because it's just a big country, and we're gonna lose, and there's gonna be other parties, and it's actually. For example, let me just structurally, in North Carolina, you can only vote in the primary of the party for which you are registered. So I have, made the decision to switch my registration to independent, because only as an independent can you choose which party primary you vote in. And the reality is that it might have been more valuable in 2016 to have been able to vote it in the Republican primary. Now, would my one vote make the difference? No, clearly not. But if we were to think about something as simple as the system of making a choice in a primary, so what if in fact party primaries just operated differently altogether, right? What if we threw out our conception of how a party primary works, and it's actually not just the party choosing, but a broader constituency that gets to choose whom the nominees are? I could live with being able to say there will be conservatives, right? There will be Republicans, there will be people with whom I deeply disagree, but I'd like them to have a soul. And I'd like to be able to know that losing an election, even if it's the kind of loss we might be experiencing right now in 2020, which is to say a partial win, a partial loss, doesn't mean losing all of your rights, that it doesn't mean losing your capacity to engage in the American project. And so I don't know if the goal here is to defeat the other side as enemies, but rather to create a powerful strategy, but continue to see them as opponents rather than as enemies.
Yes. Okay. Yes. But, or rather, this is where the rules come in.
Yeah.
The rules of the system in terms of our democracy, because you're highlighting two things. One is, in any democracy, and I've heard you say this, you have to have losers.
Oh yeah.
You have to have losers in a democracy, because otherwise then you go into an authoritarian state or an autocracy, right? So yes, we need winners and losers, and the right to oppose is fundamental in a democracy, always. However, when the rules are written in a way, right, that advantage one side over the other, then we have a serious problem. Our side seems to always be fighting on terrain that we did not create, and that was created for exclusion. And so when you have the other side, when you have the right's most important strategy is a strategy of suppression and exclusion, it actually means, like, what ideas from the Republicans did you hear in this past election cycle? What policy vision did you hear? Nothing.
Oh yeah, right. Well, but that's because, but I guess what I'd say is that's where we're in a deeply warped space, and warp space. I just got very nerd on it, right? But what I would say is, 20 years ago, I would say even 10 years ago, I did hear ideas. It's not to say I liked them, but I could tell you what those ideas were beyond tax cuts, right? So there's always the tax cut idea as a hammer solution to
the zombie ideas, yes.
Yes, that's right.
That never die, yes.
Yeah, but again, I think it's almost more comportment to it. And this is, I think, also part of the angst that people are feeling right now relative to a Biden administration, because, old Joe loves a good bipartisan engagement as well. And this idea that, like, oh, Joe's going to be too nice to the Republicans. And I think, that, yeah, who cares about being nice to any given individual Republican? But I am deeply interested in the system, right? And us fixing the system, addressing the system, tinkering with the system, not only for electoral cycle wins, not only for decade wins, right? But for the really long ones. Hey, Dorian, I see some questions.
Oh, we have some questions. All right.
We do have some questions in here. And the first question, at least that I see, comes from, is it Fiore's Bishop? Who is concerned about unregistered voters, so people who are eligible but not yet registered, and also folks who vote at the top of the ballot but don't vote down ballot, and kind of asking some questions here about why that might be. And Dorian, this definitely feels to me like if ever there were a organizing is the answer, getting the eligibles who are unregistered and also doing the educational work down ballot. I mean, that's, to me, that perhaps even more than vote choice, is so critical in terms of what organizers do.
Yes, and it goes back to nerd out a little bit, Melissa. This is a centuries-old question. In an electoral democracy, where poor and working class and middle class people outnumber the rich and wealthy, who have outsized influence in our politics, in an electoral democracy where a majority of voters actually want, say, social justice and redistribution, a range of values that we hold dear, the question is, why don't the poor soak the rich? It's a very old question. Why isn't there an alliance or a coalition of people big enough, right? And so
I know the answer. I know the answer. I answered this on my preliminary exams for my PhD 100 years ago.
And the answer is?
Racism. Isn't that the answer, right? Racism. Why is there no class politics? Racism.
That's it. That's the answer. Well, that's one part of the answer. I do yes, and the question also points to, well, what's necessary in terms of progressive infrastructure and deep organizing? Because again, if you just come into communities 2 weeks before Election Day every 2 years and expect people to show up for you when you have been absent, then no. That's ridiculous. But if you are there year round and you're investing in grassroots and ordinary folks and doing political education and leadership development and actually creating new champions from the ground up, we would see really different results. The problem is that work is really hard, and everybody wants to take a shortcut. To paraphrase the book of our friend Jay McAlevey, who's the nation's strikes correspondent, there are no shortcuts on the path to power, to transforming this country. And everybody wants a shortcut. And frankly, it's profitable to take the shortcuts, as we've been talking about. So what is necessary? And that gets to, I think, the second question, which I want to read out from the chat. So Kathy Hoekstra asks, how do we export the Abrams, Georgia model to other red, purple areas or states? That is the billion-dollar question. Imagine if we exported the Georgia model of deep community organizing and connecting people and recruiting more people. As Alicia Garza said to us on our very first podcast, make room for the awakening. None of us are born woke, and a lot of us got woke by reading The Nation, by the way. But how do we make room, right, for the awakening? How are we recruiting new people? And that takes work, and it's not 5 magic words that you put on a commercial. It's actually much, much deeper and much more labor intensive than that. And guess who are usually the best organizers willing to do that labor? It's women, and particularly women of color.
And I'd also, so I love all that. And also mention to Kathy on exactly how you just said that, Dorian, that we also don't export the model, right?
Yes.
That because it will, so I think about North Carolina where I live, which is, again, as I said on our Georgia episode, I was like, girl, what you mean Georgia's a swing state? North Carolina is a swing state, right? Like, what, please. But we have become, more entrenched, right, as a increasingly red state in a lot of important ways. But I don't think you could take the Abrams model and bring it to North Carolina, right? There's a particular, both history, there's a different set of incentives, there's different, like the towns and cities and countries, all right. So there is a model of deep organizing, but it ain't Georgia's, right? Georgia's is Georgia's and ours is ours. And so on the one hand, yes, I really appreciate the way that question is framed. Like, how do we get that winning level deep organizing? But to go to your point, Dorian, it also has to respect the particular history and structures of the space where it finds itself. I actually like Alice's question too, Alice's sister, who asks, what are the most hopeful and depressing things about the last, about this election, about 2020? And, it's funny, Dorian, because I think 2020 is like just the whole damn year is the most depressing, but also, right. And, I'm old fashioned. I do Christmas cards. So I'm sitting and like going through all the photos from the year to do the holiday card. And I was like, oh, so 2020 is horrifying. And look at all of these good and wonderful things at the same time. And that is not to minimize the horrifying. It is not horrifying, but good. It is horrifying and good. And that kind of feels like the election to me, that, man, we had a lot of not only bad outcomes, but that the processes themselves of getting us to the election day did some real damage to our public discourse, to our collective sense of trust in American political institutions. We lost real and actual people who died as a result of failed political leadership, right? 250,000 Americans, and we know it did not have to be that many. And at the same time, right, we saw these extraordinary acts of organizing, of protest, of people risking their lives to make their voices heard, not only at the ballot box, but perhaps more importantly in the streets. And that just has to give me hope. I can't help it.
I think the thing that has given me hope, particularly in this year going to election, is frankly the movement moment that we find ourselves in. The largest uprising this summer around racial justice, led by the Movement for Black Lives. And that was very hopeful because it has not only put the question of racial justice squarely on the political agenda, but it has also forced a choice for many Americans. You can't unsee the killing of George Floyd. You can't unsee the evidence, right? The video evidence of the, frankly, murder of Black people. And so people can have shown that they are in favor of a racial justice agenda and that racial justice actually can win. So that's promising. And I love the fact that the movement particularly was very clear about electoral politics. That it wasn't, say, if you go back 15 years, like a lot of folks on the left would have said, especially after the trauma of 2000, right, of that election being stolen for us and us not being ready. A lot of leftists and progressives said, "Oh, the hell with electoral politics," and that was not the posture of at least the Movement for Black Lives, and frankly, the other movement, whether it's the movement around climate justice, the young folks around ending gun violence, particularly. There's just it's a movement moment, and there's an entirely new generation that I think is more strategic, frankly, around what it will take, and sober around what it will take to actually transform this country than what we were in our 20s. Because there's
but we're X generation. So so yes, better than us, but because I think, I do think we're the best generation in a lot of ways and for a lot of reasons, and most critically because of hip hop music. Like that is, we had both the best hip hop and we gave hip hop to the world. So we don't have to really do anything else because we did that. But I don't, it's funny because I actually think in some ways this generation is less strategic, but more, so because they are so deeply intersectional,
yes,
in certain ways that is less strategic in a country that is so white supremacist, so patriarchal, so transphobic, so homophobic. So in certain ways, the insistence on intersectionality is less strategic, right? They are against respectability politics at their core. So that makes them, I think, better, but also maybe less strategic, but in all the ways that I would want them to be less strategic, right? Because they are fighting a new fight, not the old one.
Well, speaking of new and old fights, there is a question. I'm going to jump to Roger Sturtz. Do you think Kamala Harris understands social justice and can meaningfully infuse the Biden administration's policy agenda with that understanding?
Well, I think Kamala Harris is a vice president, and that, part of what's happened on the Kamala Harris thing has been odd to me, only because, so who was, I guess Dick Cheney. Because I was like, who was that powerful vice president? You remember? Okay, one. So Dick Cheney was a very powerful and influential vice president, without a doubt. But it is hard for me to imagine another vice president in the modern era who has operated in that way. And what I don't want is for us to perform the magical Black girl assumption that she's going to overcome all of the irrelevance of that office in order to somehow do some kind of critically important work that we haven't really seen vice presidents do before. I think at best, potentially, because Biden himself was a a companionate VP. He was one who was in the room and at the table and who liked his principal a lot. That if, in fact, Joe and Kamala like each other, and I don't really know if they do or not, but if they do, and if Joe Biden trusts Kamala Harris, and if he has enough remembrance of himself as a vice president to want to give the office of the vice president some authority and some sort of space on its own, and if he sees that as strategically valuable, then I could see her having a role. But in some ways, the vice president is even less influential than a first lady in terms of, even the ability to command media. One thing that Kamala Harris certainly understands is how to read the pulse of a moment. And she is extremely strategic and very ambitious. And so, and I don't mean that negatively. I think ambitious women are the shit. So I don't mean that bad. Like, I know some people say ambitious as a slur word. I don't mean that.
Yeah, it's okay if you're a man to be ambitious.
That's right. Right. So I don't mean it in that sense. I simply mean that my perception of her career, and I do not know VP-elect Harris, but my perception of her career is that in her capacity to read a moment, in her strategic thinking, and in her ambition, she has been able to move both left and right, depending on that moment. And so the work is to, if she does turn out to be more influential than most vice presidents, is to make this a movement or a moment where moving towards social justice is valuable. And then I think that's what we'll see her do.
So I want to come at this a little differently because I think the focus on Biden and Harris exclusively sends us down maybe not the most effective path. And here's what I mean by that in two ways. One is I'm struck by Reverend Jesse Jackson, Rainbow Coalition, of course, all the things, right? But I'm going back to an analysis I once heard him say, and that was...
Dorian, you went back to Jesse Jackson?
Yes, Reverend Jesse Jackson, who always, a great and long-term friend of the nation, who always said, like, let's go back in history for a minute. Abraham Lincoln was an okay president, but the abolitionist movement made him great. Franklin Roosevelt would have been an okay president, but the workers' movement and the unemployed movement, and yes, the organizing of African Americans in the 30s made him a great president. And then he goes to Lyndon Baines Johnson, of which if you had anybody in 1963, when he was sworn in on Air Force One after the assassination of John F. Kennedy, nobody, I don't think, would have predicted that Lyndon Baines Johnson would have been a champion of racial justice or ending poverty in America. And what did that? What made him great? It was a movement that pushed Johnson to make him great. So, and let me just add, Barack Obama was a good president. He wasn't a great president because movements went home, except for the movements that one thing. So that's the movement of gay and lesbian and bisexual and transgender and queer folks that kept the pressure on him to end Don't Ask, Don't Tell, to actually come out of the closet and his support for marriage equality. And it was, frankly, a movement of dreamers that continued to do civil disobedience. And when he said, because people have short memories, when President Obama said, there's nothing I can do legally for dreamers.
They wrote it. They wrote DACA and handed it to him.
Well, but yeah, there is, right? And so let's not make the same mistake.
The Dreamers wrote their own damn legislation and handed it to him. And and not to him personally, but they handed it to the administration. And they handed it to the administration in a church basement across the street from the White House because they weren't allowed to go into the White House itself as undocumented young people. And it is really one of the most extraordinary stories of courage and of perseverance. I don't know that the movements went home. I seem to remember the movements of Black Lives actually emerged during the second term, right?
2014, exactly.
Yeah, and I would say again, both and. So yes. Those movements create that pressure, but also they had presidents who had other incentive structures that also forcibly moved them in towards being able to say yes and towards needing and wanting to say yes. And so, we've had movement in the context of President Trump, but that didn't move President Trump, right? And so it's not because and that's not because it's not only because he's like not amenable ideologically or interpersonally, but also because the Republican Party created a perfect Sunday afternoon line blocking so you could never touch their quarterback, right? Like there were no holes in that offensive line.
So on this point, Melissa, I have to say this because there's a lot of conversation about how do we move and influence Biden-Harris. I wish people would put that much energy into Mitch McConnell, because there is nothing that a next administration will be able to accomplish if it is always blocked in the Senate and under the power of Mitch McConnell. So I want a lot of that energy on the strategy around the veto point, the filibuster, the cloture votes necessary that's controlled by one person in the United States Senate, depending on what happens on January 5th, by the way.
Dorian, it's so funny you say this, because when you said there's no punishment for losing earlier, when you were like, there's no cost to it. I actually thought you were going to end that sentence differently when you said there's no punishment or no cost. I thought you were going to say there's no punishment or cost for having created Trumpism, right? So again, Trump could not have effectively been who he has been the past 4 years. And it's not just complicity of the Republican Party. I just want to be so clear about this. The Republican leadership in Washington, as well as in many of the states, not all of them, but in many of the states, Republican leadership not only was complicit, it was the driver. It was the thing that made all of it possible. And so for me, again, maybe if we go back to the other question about what's most depressing, perhaps the most depressing is that there was no cost for that. That the sort of childish rudeness of President Trump's interpersonal behavior was punished at the voting booth. But everything about his fundamental underlying ideology was rewarded. And it is why even now you don't see a call from Republican leadership for the president to say that he is no longer the president after January 20th. That for me is, and I'm sorry, and so that's what brought me back again to this question of, should at least some of the work be about fighting for the soul of that party, changing who is being elected as a Republican, changing what is possible. And as you and I both know, gerrymandering is a huge part of that. It's not about, it is in part in the short term about going after individuals, but in a much larger sense, so much of this is made, not the Senate is not gerrymandered, those are states, right? But in the House, the fact that you just have that lockstep has everything to do with drawing those district lines.
Well, let me ask you a question that will allow you to rant for a second, Militia. But let me just add, there is a structural fix to the power of the Senate, which overweights rural votes, particularly in red states. Think of Wyoming having the exact same number of votes as California or New York, right? We could add DC and Puerto Rico as states and change the balance of the Senate. Okay, but here's the question. This is from Emma. Melissa Harris Perry. Melissa Harris Perry. What is the media's role in making Trump happen? And now in fixing the problem of distrust and information. And I heard a rumor you used to work in the media and know something about the inside of how big media corporations operate. So can you shed some light on that, please?
I feel like Emma already knows the answer to this question. Or Emma is a plant and actually like my cousin or something. Because as you well know, this is, so again, this is part of why I've been relatively quiet over the past 4 years, is in some ways it is patently obvious, but also very difficult for us to address. So I will say this, let me talk from just what I know. What I know for certain in 2016, so I left, I hosted a cable news show for 4 years, and I had been sort of a contributor in cable news prior to that, but certainly was much more of an insider, although never a full insider, from 2012 to 2016. And as the presidential election year for 2016 began to ramp up, it was my first opportunity to really be, like as a host, making decisions and seeing how it all worked in cable news. And in televised cable news, it was completely clear that there was an incentive structure that moved against the public interest. So if you think of the public interest in the context of an election as offering the broadest available opportunities to hear from all candidates, right? So just remember that in 2016, the Democratic side was a relatively small field, right? So there was Secretary Clinton, and there was Senator Sanders, and just for like 1 minute, there was the guy from Maryland. Now I forgot his poor little name, the little Maryland dude.
Oh, Martin O'Malley.
Martin O'Malley. There you go.
Yes.
There you go. See, because we could forget him. But it was robust on the Republican side, right? The Republican side was some wild shit. I think there were like 12 people running. There were Black people. There were women. there were Hispanics. Right? I mean, so like at one point, Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio during a debate had a fight in Spanish about who was the most authentic Latino on the stage. And I was like, this shit right here is interesting. Like fascinating, like genuinely fascinating. But let me make this story shorter. But the clear incentive was that there were two candidates who topped ratings. One was Secretary Clinton, and the other was Donald Trump. And the very clear messaging, even on the network that is presumably to the left of Fox, was that we were to take Trump at all times. And we were to take Trump when there wasn't even Trump. So you might, for example, have Jeb Bush, who granted is boring, but speaking and saying actual words. But rather than taking Jeb Bush, you were supposed to take the empty podium where Trump was going to speak, and you put a breaking news banner up that says, breaking news, Trump about to speak, which, by the way, is not a thing that is breaking news. And so any of us who made a decision not to follow that were punished for it. And the most important lesson I learned in the 4 years of doing television is that television is like air, water, love, and sunshine. Anything that you point a television camera at will grow. Period. If it's good, it will grow. If it's bad, it will grow. If you point a television camera at something, the power of television is that it makes things grow. And so we pointed television cameras at President Trump as often as possible, not because there were big, bad, evil people at a conference table, but because there were people responding to the incentives of a cable news structure where cable news is owned by a cable company or owned by Disney, right? Like Mickey Mouse is bringing you your news, right? And the result was precisely what you would think it is, that the thing that we looked at grew. And over the course of the past 4 years, that has been how President Trump has been covered. The idea that there was some like debate or fight between Trump and CNN when clearly what they were doing was feeding each other. Trump has been so very good for MSNBC, just literally saved that entire network. If you think about what your own reactions as a voter may have been, you basically been lied to by the news, who told you that Hillary Clinton was going to win, when, by the way, it was very clear that she was not. I have the receipts on having said that repeatedly and written it. But so they lied to you. And then when you were shocked and dismayed at the outcome, you then continued to watch the people who lied to you because they then made every single thing another like shocking moment. And the last thing I'll say is, and we are watching it again, we were all held hostage for about 5 days after the election, again, with breaking news banners. It said things like breaking news, Biden about to win. It said it for 5 days. And now the way that Trump's temper tantrum is being covered as though it is a real and likely coup and a real threat to American democracy, which I think is actually not particularly what it is. But boy, it keeps you watching, because otherwise you would have turned off and probably not watched again until mid-January. So what I will say is it's really hard because the incentive structures are very strongly there to create a garbage news that shocks you, that lies to you, and that keeps you watching nonetheless. But because you do feel shocked and lied to, you watch. And I get it. I was held hostage for 5 days too. So the most important thing I can say is you should probably get more of your information from podcasts and the news.
Melissa, you said something really important, and I bet a lot of listeners and viewers are very, very interested in something you just said. You just said that what the current occupant of the White House, who will be evicted very soon, what he's doing is not a coup attempt.
And so he don't have the military.
But one read of that is it's shocking and threatening, precisely because if they were more competent autocrats, they could actually pull it off, and that there's like mediocrity and incompetence going on. You just need to point at Rudy Giuliani, and we could tell all the jokes about that. Why is this not a threat to democracy?
I think that because you need the military, because that's how coups work. I mean, I'm not trying to be funny. This is like when people say, "Oh, I'm a revolutionary," and I'm like, well, "Can I see your guns?" So, I want to be careful. Let me be careful. Let me be more careful. Sometimes you and I get to talking and I stop being careful. That's why the podcast is edited. So let me be a little more deliberate. I believe that what President Trump is doing and what Republicans are clearly encouraging and allowing to happen right now is deeply damaging to our democracy. I believe that it creates a counter narrative about the health of our institutions. And listen, we're people you and I are about the business of every week structurally asking about how our institutions are broken and malfunctioning. So it's not that I don't think we need strong critique of our institutions, but I do think that what is happening right now is not a legitimate coup attempt, and primarily because in most of modern world history, you need the tanks, you need the guns, you basically need military. And at the moment, there is not any evidence that I have seen, and I'll be clear, I'm not on the inside, but there doesn't seem to be any clear evidence right now that military leaders would be willing to back President Trump in a decision not to. So just on the smallest, like the Secret Service immediately deployed in huge numbers, like before the final votes were even in, when it became pretty clear that Biden was going to be the presidential elect, right? That level of Secret Service came to him. So at the moment, I don't hear saber rattling that makes me think that if the Bidens try to enter the White House, that there's going to be an armed guard there. My little joke about revolution, I just want to be clear. I acknowledge that revolutions can happen without bloodshed, but I also want us to acknowledge that in the American story, that revolutionaries have regularly been put down by the state, which in fact has tanks, right? So that it's not that I think if you want to call yourself a revolutionary, you need to have a handgun, not at all. But it is to say that I think we have to take very seriously military power, and I don't see any indication that Trump has that on his side right now. Does that mean that he is, he has already signaled what he's doing, right? He's like, I am leaving and I am setting up a new television network that is to the right of Fox. And in order to have the viewership that I need and to have that platform, I need to I need to continue to grow this idea that everything in this current administration is illegitimate. So I just see this as a massive media building effort. And it seems pretty clear to me that, what he's doing next is storytelling, right? He's going to go do storytelling, which one might note the Obamas are also doing.
Yeah. So Melissa, we're at the lightning round phase of the conversation of questions, and there are a couple, and we should, we can go back and forth. I know there's a question about misinformation, disinformation, particularly if you think of Facebook and social media. There are some other questions around voting systems and what can we do. And then maybe we should also end on sort of what is the path forward and what's the vision and the strategy to get to closer to the promised land of justice and democracy and fairness and all of those things and freedom. So anywhere you want to start?
Well, why don't you go? So I'm going to ask you because, because there's a question in here about a progressive third party, and this is from Michael Dobler. But so you can answer it as progressive third party, or also just sort of, is there a partisan strategy to making progressive change given the realities of the systems that we operate in right now?
You got to change the rules, and everyone. Not everyone, but people don't like the harder, slower work of changing the rules of the electoral system. The rules basically create oxygen for a third party. And the way the rules are, there is no oxygen for third parties, except, I might add, and you should check them out, the Working Families Party, for instance, in New York, right, where you have fusion voting. That's a particular rule that allows you to vote third party, but not actually lose your power, but actually to enhance the power of more progressive ideas. But that is, we have a system of 50 separate and unequal voting systems. And so you've got to go state by state, unless you want to go constitutional, which is also a potential option. But you got to go state by state and change the rules of the game that allows the oxygen for third parties to breathe. That is not sexy. That's not as sexy as AOC. Like, we all love AOC, but we have to do the hard work of changing the rules. The other thing I would just say is, because there was a question about voting and different kinds of voting systems. Mm-hmm. Yes, some rich democracies actually have what's called mandatory voting. What would that look like in the U.S. context if there was a civic obligation to showing up at the polls? Other countries have done this, and they've tried it, and the sky has not fallen. Last time I checked.
An 18-year-old men in this country still have to register with Selective Service. It's not like, if you get it together, you get to register. No, you have to. And so what if every 17-year-old were registered as a voter, just period? Like, it's like, you have to be registered. It's such a different, it takes a minute for us
threatening. It's threatening for some. Yes.
Yeah. And it takes a minute for us to think that way, to go, wait a minute, voting should be a thing that we actually push people to do and encourage people to do. And again, just think about the dollars that are spent on having to encourage people to vote. Whereas if you just said, no, everyone's registered, how different it would be.
We all got to pay taxes. Well, most of us. Sorry. Most of us have to pay taxes.
700. I'm not getting over it. Okay. So, another question here is about the interstate differences. So somebody asked me to expand on how North Carolina is different from Georgia. Too many ways, Jordan. Too many ways that North Carolina is different than Georgia. We could spend a little bit of time on it, but I think my more crucial point was that. So let me just say, one of the ways is that there is a long history of white Democrats in North Carolina. And that also the entire North Carolina Constitution is largely responsible for your Bill of Rights in in other words, the Constitution of the U.S. Bill of Rights, and then the Constitution that was revised here in North Carolina after the Civil War and in the era of Reconstruction is among the most progressive constitutions in the country. It is part of why Reverend Barber's work, who you're going to hear from, began here in North Carolina, because there is actually a groundwork for doing some of this in ways that, like, the deep, ugly, nasty stories of Georgia are very different. And so in some ways it might actually make it so there are terms of accommodation. There are political terms of accommodation between Democrats and Republicans, and between Black and white communities here, that can actually be harder to pierce through, in part because it hasn't been a totalizing system of pushed out of power. And so it just means that you have to organize folks differently. And then, so I'll go to this question. And I love this one, and I'm going to pitch it to you, and Peter's telling us to stop now. So we've used the language of deep organizing. We've held it up. Just for folks who don't do organizing work, one example, like, you don't have to do the whole strategy, just one example of what it means to be organizing in any given neighborhood or community or state.
Oh, I will try to be quick. This is really hard. So let me, organizing really is about relationships. It's about relationships. It's about solidarity. And it requires work, though. It requires conversations with your people in your social network who trust you and whom you trust, your friends, your neighbors, your family members. And yeah, everybody, you should be doing Thanksgiving this year on Zoom. And you can still have family conversation and a drink on Zoom, as one example. But it requires, right, like challenging each other. It requires, debates and imagining like, well, what is the world that I want for my kids? And asking questions like, well, why does this suck right now? Like, if you're a person living in poverty who happens to be broke, like, why is it that we don't have enough money to live on, much less thrive? Like, and walking people through a process of understanding, well, what are the systems that affect all our lives? But also giving them a set of tools to change those systems, right? Because you don't want to leave people stuck in like, well, the system is overwhelming and therefore there's nothing to do. No, there are people that decide and design the rules of our systems, which means that there are people who could decide and redesign those rules. And that's what organizing is really about, is getting a whole bunch of people together and not just talking to yourselves, by the way, but then seeing who else you can get to join in the struggle, right? Who else are we going to recruit to the fight? Let me leave you this one example, Melissa. I do think there is an incredible organizing opportunity in America right now, in rural America. And in union organizing, I used to be a union organizer. We always used to say when talking to workers, the boss is the best organizer, because the boss would always do the shitty stuff that makes workers' lives hard. And so you like have a strategy to organize people collectively to take on the boss that you then negotiate with, right, with your power to win a settlement, right, that improves your life. Yep. In this situation, COVID is like the boss. Mm-hmm. COVID is the best organizer. And if you look at the absolute wreckage in rural America in terms of hospitals, and the lack of research, and when I say rural, don't mistake me for don't assume white in your head only, because there are a lot of Black rural people in Georgia, and there are a lot of Asian and Latinx rural people in places in Iowa and Nebraska, all over the place, right? So this could be a multiracial organizing moment, and especially in rural America that does not have the resources, where hospitals are already overrun, where there will be incredible harm, sickness, and death in the coming months, because of an ideology and a set of systems, right, that have created these conditions for people. So I actually think this is an organizing opportunity, not just in cities and suburbs, but also in rural America, to say, this is what's happening to you and us. Our fates are linked. So how do we embark in solidarity with each other on transforming these systems that affect our lives?
Dorian, thank you so much. And I do want to say to everyone who's listening, thanks for sticking with us as we ran long. Dorian and I have been organizing each other for 21 years. If organizing is about being in relationship, and so I will say that to end on that, that it also means being willing to be vulnerable enough to be wrong in some circumstances, to actually listen when you ask a question. Organizing isn't about showing up and telling people. It's actually about finding out, and it is about spending that time. And again, when I say Dorian and I have been organizing each other for 21 years, it's in part because we have stayed in conversation with each other, sometimes disagreeing, sometimes just helping each other see things differently. And I really hope that part of what System Check will bring for those of you who choose to be listeners and subscribers is that you'll see some of the work that we've been up to and that we're continuing to be up to. I hope that you'll see that we're willing to be wrong, and that we consistently are trying to seek out guests who teach us things, and that hopefully we can be co-learners along with our audience. I want to say thank you to the nation for inviting us to be part of the festival. Thank you for the platform of the podcast, for giving us an extraordinary young producer, Sophia Einart Evoy, who is just making us sound much better and smarter and greater than we are. And to Frank Reynolds, who also is supporting us and continuing to organize us as new podcasters. And we really hope that this festival time is valuable for all of you.
So thanks so much, Melissa. I love you dearly, sister. And now we're going to hand things off to Sarah Burke, who's going to tell us what's next.
Awesome. Thank you both. That was incredible. How's everybody doing? What an amazing festival this has been so far. So thank you for sticking with us through 4 days. I can't believe we're almost to the end already. It feels like we just got started. We're so thankful that you're all here, and just by being here, you're supporting our work. Melissa and Dorian reminded us really clearly this morning of the critical importance of independent journalism, not the mainstream cable news that gave rise to Trumpism. I'm really proud to work for the nation, to be part of something that's very different, something that's better. And so if you're able, I really do hope that you'll make a donation to support our work. Subscribe to the Nation if you haven't yet. Our subscribers, our donors, you're what makes it possible to fund our deep investigative journalism that is very expensive and time consuming. It supports podcasts like Melissa and Dorian's. So any support that you can give, we're so thankful. And you're the reason that we're all here. So thank you very much. We're going to head to break now, and we will be back in a little bit with Reverend Barber.